Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Conversations with Carra. My name is Gian-Carlo. I have the amazing honor of being the City Councillor for the great neighborhoods of East Calgary, designated as Ward 9 in the city's ward system, and I am your candidate for re-election on October 18. This is a critical election for the City of Calgary. I feel like everyone is pretty much in consensus that we're sort of at an existential tipping point moment for our city, and we will either decline as cities across the world and across human civilization have declined when their core industry sort of was significantly interrupted, or we will rise on our strengths. And we have considerable strengths to rise upon, and something that is infusing every element of life these days is technology. And so the conversation we're having today with some amazing leaders in the technology field here in Calgary is tech in YYC. Before I begin and introduce two of the three people who will be joining us today, I just want to do a land acknowledgement, and that is critical to our commitment to dismantling systemic racism in our city, to becoming an actively anti-racist city, and to deeply committing to truth and reconciliation. And what we do when we acknowledge that we are Treaty 7 people is that we are decolonizing the history that we understand ourselves to be living within. No longer do we assume that the project of building community on this land began 130 years ago with the arrival of Euro-Canadian settlement. We acknowledge that the project of building community on this land began in time immemorial with the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot people, the Tsuut'ina people, the Aye Nakota people, the Métis people with their long history on this land. And today we're very lucky to welcome people from all over the world, Indigenous people from around Turtle Island, Euro-Canadians, and now international Canadians who call this amazing place home and who are committed to making community together. So without further ado, I have Greg Hart, who I've known for quite some time as just sort of a polymath in the scene. Greg Hart is a lifetime entrepreneur and is both a founding partner of the ecosystem studio Thin Air Labs and the design-focused unschool Inception U. He is working for a regenerative future that integrates social, environmental, and economic activity to produce a world that supports all of us being successful. Meaningful design of our cities, our learning, our ventures is the cornerstone of this work. When things are going well and he wants to get yelled at, he referees lacrosse. We also have Alice Riemer, who is a successful technology entrepreneur and dedicated community leader and mentor, currently the CEO of Philip, a fintech startup leading digital transformation in the small business fuel card industry, and the site lead of Creative Destruction Lab Rockies. Alice works with Canadian academic, government, and investment organizations to help accelerate technology companies with the potential to transform the world's social, industrial, and economic landscape. And at some point during this conversation, someone named Denis Ram is going to be dropping in on us, coming in hot. You guys both came in hot. We didn't have a lot of time to lay out what we were going to talk about, but I have absolutely no concern that we're going to have a great conversation. So why don't I just open up with a very broad conversation. I'm going to encourage that we talk amongst ourselves rather than have me interview you, but I can interview you too. We're not going to lack for conversation. Greg, talk to me about tech and YYC, and then Alice can call bullshit on that.
Okay, so tech and YYC. Well, first of all, I mean, you said something before, which I think is really important, which is that technology is everywhere. So it's kind of weird, like it gets talked about as if it's its own sector, but in reality, and Alice's own work it's infused into everything that we're doing. And I know that I was asked once before in an interview about, where are the opportunities for the future? And I think one of my responses at the time was, well, think about a kind of work that's being done where tech has not made a big impact yet. And then look there, because it's going to make a big impact. Like the integration of both software and hardware elements of technology are literally infusing every part of the economy in our day-to-day lives, often in ways we don't even notice. So it's sort of like tech and YYC. It's not something we can escape. It's part of who we are. The question becomes, are we in a position to take the skills and talents and motivations that we have here and then turn it into something really serious in terms of our economic future? And I think that the foundation is definitely there for that. And there's a lot of exciting momentum showing that we have a really good shot going in that direction.
True or false, Alice?
I would like to disagree with Greg just because I think it would be good discussion and discourse, but I actually can't. I think the thing that, just to highlight a couple of things. One, and first and foremost, technology cuts, as Greg said, cuts across all sectors, and it's places that we actually don't even think about it. So we know that we have an energy sector here. It has been a dominant employer of our city and our province for many, many years. Huge innovators. Absolutely ginormous innovation happening inside of the energy companies that we have here, big and small. And even as we think about the energy transition and the innovation as we move to a low carbon future, our energy sector is, one of the global leading innovators driving some of that change. And so I think it's important to note that, as you brought us forward, talking about our current, current dominant industries here in Alberta. The other thing I think it's important to think about is there's also technology innovation in places that we don't typically think about it. We've seen it now with the rise of COVID, perhaps in things like telemedicine or healthcare and life sciences. But, now I'm, Gian-Carlo, you've invited me, so now I get to be on my soapbox about why I think this is such a great place to live and work in technology innovation. We have some unique advantages in our city and in our province that no other city has in Canada. So I'll just, if I may, an example is,
Yes.
In terms of the...
Jump in. Do it.
Okay, so in terms of health and life sciences. So in the province of Alberta, we have two research-intensive medical universities. The University of Calgary has a research-intensive medical school. We have one of the leading brain institutes. We have a huge investment in post-secondary innovation and moving from invention to innovation and that translational research. We have a vet school. And not only that, we have the only single-payer health system in the country. So Alberta Health Services provides us a unique advantage for our health innovators. We have a few constraints there in terms of how we get them to really adopt technology, but all of the right ingredients are here for us to truly be a world-leading innovation center across many sectors, not just energy, not just health, digital technology, the work that Greg is doing in terms of, innovation and talent development. Like, we just have so many opportunities here. We just have to make sure we've got the right, we've got all the ingredients. We've got to make sure we got the right bowl and we're stirring the right way. So.
Amazing. There's a couple of things that I've been sort of noodling on in the lead up to this, and one of them, and I'll sort of say this jocularly, but I think it needs to be explained. One of the jokes that we have on our council text is whenever we're talking about economic development or diversification of our economy, which are really front and center considerations for city council, is when experts come and speak to us, there's the conversation about the ecosystem, and so we've turned it into sort of like, anytime anyone says ecosystem, everyone texts to everyone, drink, because that's our drinking game. What is an ecosystem? What are we talking about when we talk about the ecosystem, the tech ecosystem? And I mean, I know that Greg is gonna really jump in on this one, but I really want to hear what you have to say about that too, Alice.
Greg's on mute. You're first, Greg.
Yeah, okay, I'm first. That was what I was going to ask you. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button. Yeah, what is an ecosystem and what does it really mean? I think is really so many of these words kind of transition into like buzzword territory, which is why they become great subjects for drinking games. And I would say that, one of the things that as we've worked over the last 5 years to build one of these ecosystems around, I wouldn't say just technology, but around what might be called brace yourself for another buzzword, innovation economy, one that's trying to create new value that's not been created before, different ways. But one of the things we've talked about a lot is that, an ecosystem is all the interacting parts, and it needs to be seen like a natural ecosystem in that way, that there are services being exchanged between different things in a natural ecosystem that allow the entire system to flourish. And that may mean that individual parts of that system succeed more than other individual parts of the system, but there's certain elements that need to be present for the whole thing to be rich and to produce lots of activity that's really interesting and contributes to success. And so I think part of the challenge around ecosystem thinking, to take it past a buzzword, is we're used to a stakeholder environment where we come to a meeting or whatever, and we start thinking about, well, I've got this thing that I'm working on, and Alice has a thing that she's working on, and GC wants to get reelected. And so we show up at the table with that sort of stakeholder mentality. But for ecosystem success to work, the actual thing that we need to show up to the table with is a commitment to the health of the ecosystem. Actually looking and saying, what needs to be present in order for this thing to become this regenerating, growing thing that we can depend on for a long, long time. And so to try and move it past the buzzword, that's where I would come at this ecosystem thing.
And I'm going to jump in because, Greg, you couldn't have given me a better segue into talk about Rainforest Alberta, right?
Sure.
So, in fact, it just came up on my Instagram that we are now celebrating 5 years of Rainforest Alberta, and it was one of Greg's partners that was one of the co-founders, Jim Gibson, alongside a gentleman named Brad Zumwalt, who really said, look, at the end of the day, ecosystems are about creating the environment by which plants, in our case, companies, can form and grow. And a fully functioning ecosystem doesn't mean that every plant survives. It doesn't mean that every company that gets started needs to start and scale and become, a massive unicorn. In fact, we actually need some companies to start and fail. We need that experience of companies starting and failing so that they can actually go back into the soil and create sort of, the rich environment of experience by which new companies can form again. And so, as a result of that work, there was a social contract formed for, the innovation ecosystem. And really, to Greg's point, it was all of the stakeholders who are interested in guiding the conversation, creating the collaboration, and adhering to a set of principles about what does it mean to be part of an innovation ecosystem in Calgary and, in Alberta. And so, wildly successful about this social contract, this ability to have these conversations, and your commitment as an individual to participate in our ecosystem, not, standing at the sidelines and throwing barbs, but really how are you going to get engaged and be part of that conversation? Because it's important to our city, our province, to our country.
Yeah, and actually, I think, to put an exclamation point on one of the things that Alice mentioned there about the need, and this is part of that regenerative cycle, for things to not work, to quote unquote die, go into the soil and come back again. I mean, you look at a much more famous ecosystem, or a long-standing one, which would be like the Waterloo kind of scenario in Ontario. I mean, the implosion of BlackBerry, during the time that the iPhone was on the rise, actually turned out to be a very powerful stimulant for the ecosystem in that area, because you had all of that experience, the money, everything else there, going back into the soil and coming back up as like 100 different things instead of one thing. So I think that is the key idea about the ecosystem, is it does have fragile elements in it, but that as a whole integrated living thing, it can produce a lot of prosperity.
I want to take this conversation in two directions, but I think the first thing I want to ask is, are either of you willing to sort of like chart our ecosystem with regard to tech and YYC right now, and sort of just like give us a sort of an understanding of, where are we at in the successional growth of it? What are the major sort of flora and fauna regimes that we're thinking about?
Now we're talking biology.
Maybe we'll start. I'm comfortable talking about this because I've employed this metaphor for years as a city builder, and that's another place I want to go. The relationship between the tech ecosystem and city building, but we'll do that later. Let's just talk about the ecosystem, and maybe I'll just say one more thing, and that is, of course, that Calgary Economic Development's Calgary in the New Economy Plan, which is talking about how we do have a much more diversified economy right now than we ever have, since we were a big oil place. And, we're transitioning oil and gas to energy writ large. We have agribusiness. I think we have more head office agribusiness companies in Calgary than any other city in North America. Transportation and logistics, which is a critical thing for our inland port and has been around since the CP Rail established the Ogden shops. Tourism is an emerging thing. Creative industries is an emerging. Life sciences, which Alice spoke about, and then financial services, which Alice also spoke about. These are not tech industries, but you can't do them without a healthy tech ecosystem overlaid onto these other things. Yeah. Who wants to take a shot at, maybe discussing where we're at and what the limits of this ecosystem are?
So how about I take the first shot at that, because I think Greg will be able to then parlay that into your city building, because he's got much more of that urban development piece than I can contribute in a meaningful way. And so, as a high level, I would say we, from an innovation ecosystem or from an ecosystem, tech ecosystem perspective, we have come a long way in the last 5 or 7 years, but we are still behind. In terms of what you might see in terms of major centers in, say, Vancouver or Toronto or Montreal. And there's reasons for that, and we can talk about that. But I would say that we have made incredible strides in terms of progress, really, even in the last sort of 24 and 36 months. And so, if you're an early stage innovator today, whether you're in a post-secondary institution or you're in your garage, there is no shortage of services, opportunities, mentors, programs for you to be able to start your business here, whether it's at Platform Calgary, for example, and participating in some of those early stage programs, whether that's, you're an inventor inside the university and you need to get your innovation out and you need to start to work towards commercialization. And so there's no shortage of opportunities if you're an early stage innovator and you have an idea and you want to move it through a process. If you are someone who isn't necessarily an entrepreneur, but wants to participate in the early stage or entrepreneurial community, and you might be coming from a different market, for example, and Greg will talk a little bit about this, there are programs now like Inception U, where you can actually go from being perhaps a geologist or a geophysicist and train to learn how to participate in a digital, or I don't like the word new economy, by the way, we'll talk about that, but in a different type of organization, and that domain experience and expertise that you bring to new technology or new companies are there. And so I'd say we're well on our way to putting, again, all of the right ingredients, and in many instances, the bedrock there. And then I'll quick plug for the program that I run. We now have a program at the University of Calgary we're going into our 5th year, called Creative Destruction Lab, Rockies. And it's really about how do we accelerate companies, particularly in the deep tech space, how do we accelerate their commercial potential? So in the last 4 years, our companies have raised $325 million US, 162 million of that has been in the province of Alberta. We've had over 400 MBAs participate in the programs, and we've created probably north of that in terms of jobs. And so that's just surrounding early stage companies and innovators and entrepreneurs with the capital, with the community, with the programming that they need to be able to help accelerate their technologies. Where we need to focus now is actually building an ecosystem that supports scale. So, we've invested a ton over the last decade in, creating the right rainforest, if you will, creating the right environment by which we can get innovators out of their garage or out of their university lab to help create companies. Now, what we need to do is help those companies stay here and scale. We need to make sure that we've got the capital. We need to make sure that we've got the community. We need to make sure that we've got the talent to be able to help those companies stay here, build here, and scale here. And we have a number of, examples. Benevity, Solium, which was sold to Morgan Stanley, Absorb, LMS, which is, a huge success that was just down the street. And I think in the Brooklyn of Calgary, in your neighborhood. And so, I think we're well on our way, but we can't stop. We're punching a little above our weight class, but we need to continue to invest, and we need to continue to build that momentum.
And I would add to that by just saying that, Alice and I have talked about this, and lots of us have talked about this. We can't really afford to follow the same trajectory that some of these other places have followed. Because we started from behind, punching above our weight is great, and we need to continue to do that to try to leapfrog some of these steps And so a lot of it does come down to, making sure we have the services to support the scaling of companies that are growing here. And then also to have the supports in place to fill the so-called top of the funnel with more and more ventures, right? Like to get more and more people producing ventures so that there's sort of a critical mass of activity inside the ecosystem. And then one kind of interesting point on this, I think, is that, having brought people here who have spent lots of time in Silicon Valley and in other big innovation ecosystems around the world, one of the things that they always remark to me is we have an opportunity to build our own ecosystem here, which is to say it's not a copy of what happens in other places. It's not an attempt to replicate how Toronto is functioning. It's not an attempt to replicate what's happening in Silicon Valley or London or whatever. It's actually about building something that has a character about the place that we live and the challenges that we face and everything else. And I think naturally that's going to gravitate towards some of the industries that have been here traditionally. And I'm really glad that Alice talked about health, because Alberta is like in an incredibly powerful position here, both by the graduates that we produce from our universities, the research that's there, the money that's willing to be invested in these areas, and the crown jewels of the health data that is housed within Alberta Health. So, there's an opportunity for us to keep this thing going and to really build a character around it that is special to where we are.
I noticed that Denis Ram is joining us. Denis, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well. Sorry for joining in there late. Apologies.
No, we were given fair warning that you were tied up at work and that you'd be coming in hot. If I could just take a moment and I'll introduce Denis, and then I'll sort of try and repackage where we're at in the conversation, because I think it's a great segue to talk about why I invited Denis to join us. So Denis Ram just finished his final year of law school at the University of Alberta, where he recently won first place at the International Iron Tech Lawyer Competition hosted by Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., for his novel police complaint app. The app was developed through extensive engagement with the city, police, activists, and other stakeholders, and is now a nonprofit that has received funding to take it from concept to usage. Currently, he is working at a large law firm in Calgary as the head of the nonprofit Complete Complaints, and also sits on the City of Chestermere's Anti-Racism and Inclusion Committee. And I met Denis Ram because he was one of the standout presenters last July, not July, but the July before that, when we invited the Black Lives Matter protests from the streets into the halls of our government and undertook a 3-day inquiry into systemic racism. And now he's, as I just said in his, he took some of that direct anti-racism service and operationalized it through technology. And I'm going to get him to talk about that a little bit, but just to sort of let you know, we're right now fleshing out what a tech ecosystem looks like and how there is no real tech sector in the sense that everything is technology based. And we're in the process of building a economy of technological innovation that supports the unique conditions and opportunities that we have here in Calgary. So Denis, do you want to tell us a little bit about how you innovated in the tech space to address a unique need in the community?
Yeah, sure. So I think just off the bat, I'm involved in, I guess, an area called legal tech. So it's a new and emerging area. There's a lot of different ways we're seeing lawyers take advantage of tools, of technology tools in order to automate a lot of different systems. So specifically, what we've done, with our police complaint app, is we used a tool. It's called guided interviews. Where you ask plain language questions, and then at the end of the plain language questions, the app puts together some sort of PDF or letter as if it was generated by a lawyer. And this example right here, it's just so many applicable areas that this can apply to. When you think about what is it that a lawyer does, asking questions and then drafting a letter. That's, about 80% of the job for a lot of different lawyers. So then to really apply it to, what are some novel uses for this? Last year we heard time after time, unreported police complaint after unreported police complaint. And we really thought, why is it that there's so many unreported police complaints to the point where, we almost have to have, a full circus in front of city council with, people living their re-traumatization all over again, when, we could just fix the system with better tech. And, with better tech, a lot of the times we talk about, oh, Facebook is great, someone made $1 billion off of it. But we're not talking about how tech can be used in the nonprofit sector as well. And, specifically how it can be used to increase access to justice. So that's kind of what I'm really focusing on right now, especially with our nonprofit here. And, we've already seen steps with the city of Calgary, taking those supportive roles, whether it's, providing funding, for these initiatives, or if it's actually just helping with engagement like, you've done already, Carra. So that's kind of where my stance is with regards to technology and kind of where I'm involved with that right now.
So thanks, Dennis. Do you have any questions or responses to that, Greg or Alice?
Well, I was just going to say that, it touches up against this idea of the, yet another set of buzzwords, smart cities, right? This idea of smart cities. But what Dennis is talking about is, even some of that legal tech fits into that picture when you start talking about the massive services like policing and other things that underline the operation of a city. And it always, the question is something that we deal with a lot in the Inception U program. And it's, in talking with colleagues at other places like Stanford, who are doing this kind of work, that increasingly sort of this ethical dimension of technology is becoming a larger and larger piece. And, a smart city can be a place where everybody is very efficiently and effectively surveilled, for instance, and that would qualify as a smart city. But it could also be a place where technology is put to work to deepen the humanity of the experience of living in a city. And so here, the goals of innovation and technology become a really important part of the conversation, and does tie back to, what kind of sector are we building? But, if you wanted to have a smart city, then you want it to be supporting things like justice. And you don't want it to be something that's supporting something like, sort of unfettered surveillance of people and that sort of thing. So that's a really strong connection that I see there with the work that Dennis is doing.
So I want to dig into sort of city and play, unless you wanted to just say something, Alice.
No, I just one quick comment. I think what the other thing we can't forget is the area we're talking about, legal tech, but it's also social innovation, right? Yeah. So we actually measure the outcome of a social innovation company, Dennis, if I may, like yours, differently than we do a for-profit company and what they're doing. That doesn't mean they aren't here to scale and grow. How we fund them, how we support them, how we help them grow is just a little bit different. And the outcome that we're driving towards with social innovation is impact. And so you can already see the kind of impact that the company that Dennis is building will have in comparison to, the organization I'm building in terms of different types of impact, equally as important to the city and the sectors that we're trying to build.
So I'd like to dig into city building a little bit, because that's obviously sort of the major wheelhouse of your city council and your city government. Because we will talk about what the council coming into this new term on October 19th after the election can do to really accelerate and support the growth of the intersection. But the ecosystem. Let's talk about city building. And I think there's the smart city side of things, which Greg started to touch on, and I want to dig into that a little bit more. But there's also just sort of like the basic place-based city, because, and I'll put it this way. I remember when we were first, like years ago, when I was first a brand new city councilor, and I was talking about placemaking and city building. And we were talking about the need to diversify our economy, and people were talking about, establishing a tech sector. And there was like the University Research Park, sort of up by Brentwood Station. And there was a play by Canada Olympic Park to maybe sort of put a tech innovation center, in their sort of suburban location next to the COP ski hill. And I was pushing back on people talking about that, saying, I think they want to be in places like Inglewood and Ramsey, personally, and Bridgeland, like real neighborhoods, and they want to have. And so let's talk about that. There's the neighborhood-based aspirations of tech entrepreneurs and city built direct connection to city building. There's the regional connection to just a great Western Canadian life. And then, wending Denis's work into it, there's our increasing understanding that in order to deliver on the promise of Canadian pluralism and to be a beacon of hope in an increasingly tumultuous world, we have to actually deliver on that promise of pluralism and be actively anti-racist and dismantle the systems of racism that act as oppression for too many of our neighbors. So who wants to jump in on that question?
Well, I can start. I mean, it's a really rich area. I like the fact that you alluded to, aside from the smart city stuff, there's just the good old fashioned bones of how you create neighborhoods and the places where people like to live and work and hang out. And we've certainly seen this. And when you get asked about COVID, often, did it introduce new things? Well, I think it accelerated a lot of trends that were already present. And, one was this move towards hybrid work and underlining the fact that talent is quite mobile. So, I mean, people can work from anywhere largely in a lot of the work that we're talking about here today. And so now that puts a new pressure on the place that you choose to live. So if before you were depending on getting some other qualities of your life from being in the place where your office was that was different from where you lived during the rest of the day, then all of a sudden you found yourself not going to the office anymore. Now there's new pressure on the place that you hang out all the time to be more complete, to be able to do all the things that you needed to do. And we've certainly seen with talent that we've imported into Calgary that they do disproportionately end up in the Inglewood, Ramsey, Bridgeland kind of neighborhoods. They like being able to walk to a grocery store now that there is one in those areas. And that was so critical. It's a good example. No grocery store, how complete is your community? So there's, we're definitely seeing that. And then the traditional things that people would come here before, which is proximity to the mountains and everything, for some of the people who are working in the tech area, surprisingly, that's not as important to them. Those local amenities in their neighborhood actually were the things that they talked about most, and whether they could get around on their bikes safely and they could walk to places. And then once they're here, then they discover the mountains and go, oh, that's kind of cool. We can do that. But it wasn't, the leading attraction for them coming into the city. So I think that the connection around talent and where we want to be and everything is a big, big chunk of where the ecosystem of technology and innovation links up with the reality of, the quality of life in a city.
Denis, you're a young guy. Young guys are leaving the city in droves. You're a young guy of color too. You want to talk about the importance of what kind of city we need to build?
Yeah, I think that's actually a little bit twofold right there. First is, how do we draw young talent into Calgary, specifically with tech? Greg already said they are very mobile. They're all working online. For them, it doesn't matter where their home base is. If they're somewhere better, they can easily move. They don't have those same levels of connections and anchors as, elderly do. But I think importantly too, something that gets missed a lot of the times when we talk about tech is diversity in tech. You alluded to it a little bit here. Even when we're discussing things like, do we want to be in Ramsey or Inglewood, or do we want to be out in COP? None of these are areas that is a very multicultural area. These are all very predominantly white. So, if we're talking about, innovating the tech sector, why aren't we considering throwing in one of these innovation hubs in the Northeast? Or where there are a lot of talent, and this isn't just, tech people who used to, be engineers in somewhere in Asia, and now they're living in Canada, which, we have a lot of, but even just, you want to add on to the disproportionate, advantages that certain groups have where, if they want to, work for a great, fun, legal tech sector company, they can walk a few blocks and they're there versus our most disadvantaged folks who may actually be overtrained and there's not not able to actually get the same credentials here, we're completely now blocking them out of the system where, they're going to have to take an hour-long train ride and 2 buses to get to where they need to go. I think there's a really big factor there, specifically that our city council has ignored, which is how do we diversify the tech sector? How do we stop allowing the same group of predominantly white men to choose what is tech innovation? And, we've seen things such as, facial recognition, where, I remember back when I bought my first Xbox Connect, it never was able to recognize my face. And that's still a real issue we're seeing all the time with tech everywhere. So what kind of steps can the city take is, I think, a great question council needs to really consider for how we can actually diversify the tech sector. Like when it comes to what advantages does Calgary have, sure, we've got a lot of great advantages, but we've also got a lot of big disadvantages. Weather is obviously a big one, I think we can all agree on. So if we
I'm going to call bullshit on weather, but that's a story for another time.
But then if we're looking at something like, Calgary's got one of the most diverse tech sectors, that could be a great area of drawing in talent that would have otherwise never considered coming to Calgary. And then when we're talking about, the youth, how are we getting youth involved? The youth aren't looking to go and work somewhere where everyone looks like they're one type of person, where everyone thinks the same thoughts, and where everyone does the same thing. Diversity goes hand in hand with drawing in young talent. And, money and all that aside, which, let's be real, is the most important thing for, a lot of young people, is cost of living and how that balances out with their salaries. No one wants to work in a place where 3 years from now, they might get, canceled for working for the wrong boss. And, that's something in the tech sector specifically that a lot of people are looking for guidance on.
And diversity, of course, is essential to functioning ecosystems. Alice, as a woman in technology in Calgary, you need to jump in here.
Well, first things first, I don't know if anybody noticed, but Denis kept slipping into legal tech. It's way more than legal tech out there. I'm just teasing. I think that those are all really good points. I mean, I think that's, it is so important that we have diversity across, our teams and our talent. It's not even a question. It should be an expectation. And the way I think that, from a city perspective, we can actually do that is we can actually commit to it. So, the idea of having a co-working space or a community space up in the Northeast, as well as, we have a nice density of startups and early stage companies and scaling companies in Inglewood and Bridgeland and the Ramsey area. And so how do we actually, opportunities to actually build community connections between communities, if that makes sense, and facilitating those kinds of, conversations and dialogues, I think are really important. As a woman in tech, like I'll tell you, women in tech, women in finance, women in investment, the numbers are not good. Let me just share that with you, but they're getting better. And it's coming through work that, as an example, an organization that I'm part of called the 51, Access for Female Entrepreneurs to Female Capitals. It's SheEO, it's Alberta Women Entrepreneurs. And so it isn't, it's the same things that we were talking about, in terms of the tech sector. It's also not only building technology across sectors, it's also making sure that we're building an inclusive technology sector, inclusive technology ecosystem. So.
I'm just going to throw in, just to continue talking about it, I use a lot of ecological metaphors when I'm talking about city building, but one of my tech metaphors is that the complete, compact, walkable neighborhood is the best piece of hardware that human beings have ever developed to run the software of a vibrant culture and a diversified economy. And when you actually network these computing nodes together, you get supercomputing, civilizational technology or capabilities. And I think that that's true. And do we want to touch on smart cities a little bit, or in the time remaining, do we want to talk about what the council of the 2021 to 2025 term has to do to provide adequate leadership to emerging these ecosystems in an equitable and diversified way?
I think as a transition or segue maybe between what we're just talking about and that, one of the things with the Inception U programs, one of the things we've been very, very pleased with over the last several years as we've been running these programs, and I just before coming here today was working with the new cohort, the new cohort is, I believe, more than 50% people of color. So like there's a really, we've been very successful at building very diverse cohorts, bringing people into tech. And I mean, I think we understand why we've been able to do that. But the other thing that goes with it is the number of people that we've encountered who are relatively new immigrants to Canada, who are very skilled and would be super useful to have, in some of these companies that we're talking about. The barriers to getting them through that process into there is to me like one of the top issues that we need to think about, even to the point of they could get financial support to go into our program, except it turns out they're working more than 30 hours a week, say driving for Uber and then the government says, well, I'm sorry, you're not considered underemployed, you're employed. And it's like, no, they're wickedly underemployed because the skills that they have, but they have to provide for their families, right? So there's this tension there, which is one of those structural barriers that we need to talk about, and we need to deal with that. And the other one that I would mention there is the reason why people want to be in Bridgeland and Inglewood and Ramsey and these places is because of the quality of place. So if we only build quality of place where we have it right now, then that's going to be a very limited vision for the city. If we want stuff to go into the neighborhoods in the Northeast, for instance, where there is a much higher diversity of people, then we need to bring a real commitment to creating quality of experience and quality of space for those people. And we have instruments like we've talked about at Inception. We're connected with the library. We work out of the central library. But we've talked about how can we take what we're doing there and push it out so that if you're somebody who's living in Forest Lawn or in Saddle Ridge or one of these places where you're working 2 jobs to try to keep things going for the family, but have aspirations of moving into this space, how do we make that easier for you to do that? Because Alice's companies, my company, like all of us would love to have that in our company, but there are some structural barriers that I think that's something council can start to be thinking about. How do we deal with that?
I'm just going to give a little shout out to the communities of Greater Forest Lawn, up the Max Purple line, networked into the system. We got to build those out. And, my Rise Together platform and my work in those communities is very focused on that. And then, of course, Ogden along the Green Line with its entire other half being the CP Rail shoplands, which are sort of like a Quarry Park version 2.0 waiting to happen. Anyway, Dennis, Alice, you want to jump in on marching orders for your new city council?
Councilors? Yeah, I mean, I think, if you look back at the Calgary Economic Development, as the steward of the strategy for the city, one of them, of course, is around talent and innovation and livable city and business friendliness. And I think, the city itself is doing a whole bunch of things that I'm not sure are well known by our citizens. So, for example, they're working on innovation and procurement. They're looking at new ways in terms of helping support, green or cleaner initiatives so that you can, convert your house or, finance solar, for example. And so I think those are the kinds of things and the opportunity to, and I've shared this, I talk about it ad nauseum. Companies go where customers are and cash goes where companies are. And so, municipalities are not well known to sell to as an early stage company. And so, having a way that early stage companies can come and participate with the city. So, as an example, some of the things the city is looking at is, drone delivery, right? Like, would anybody know that we're piloting drone delivery services or the work that we're doing in terms of 5G? And I think it's making sure that we do not lose sight of the fact that the city, its departments, its citizens can be customers, which will bring companies, which will bring capital, which means we will have a flourishing innovation ecosystem. And so, from if I were to, put a huge plea to our councillors, it would be work as hard as you can to break down any barriers in order to continue to drive innovation within and for the city, the citizens, the companies that are here and the municipality as a whole.
I love that. And I just want to give a little bit of a shout out. I spent the last 4 years of the last term helping maturate a benefit-driven procurement policy that will, if you want to be completely cynical, it's a workaround for international trade agreements to sort of really focus on local employment, but it's really focused on sort of working towards local benefits, which are a really important part of it. And I'll give another shout out. I mean, in the energy space, I just met with entrepreneurs from a startup called Catal Energy, which is greening diesel fuel with technology and a secret sauce developed, proprietary secret sauce developed here, and the importance of like a city transit fleet of buses being an early adopter to things like that, right? So I get it, and I'm 100% on board. Dennis, you have anything to sort of jump in? I mean, as someone who's hopefully going to have your work with complete complaints sort of pioneered by the city.
Yeah, I've actually got three kind of marching orders, if you will, for what I would personally like to see, what I've heard from other community members that they would like to see.
I'm gonna write them down.
Yeah, that'd be. I wrote them down myself as well. So the first one, it ties into what Greg was saying about accessibility. There's a lot about accessibility that we can really focus on with tech. We've seen, because of COVID, maybe one of the silver linings of COVID is that so much has moved online now. If you want to call in to a city council meeting, if you want to Zoom in on a city council meeting, these are things you can do now without having to take off, an entire day of work, hire a babysitter, come down, pay for parking downtown, and then, you'd speak for 5 minutes, but you wasted half a day. Instead of all of that, just continuing, what we've seen with, can you Zoom in? Can you call in? For example, a few years ago, when I was part of the state student union, during the secondary suite debates, we'd see about, 40, 50 senior citizens walk in, all complaining about secondary suites and affordable housing because they can afford to, versus everyone else that really needed access to all that couldn't.
But in the defense of those people, we did legalize suites and it destroyed the entire city, didn't it?
Affordable housing, right?
That's right. No, that's right. No destruction. It's only helped. Okay, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. I think, when we're thinking about accessibility, I think income is one side of it. Another side of it is for those with physical disabilities. If you've never been to the downtown, city council, how are you going to know where to go, what to do? It's all very intimidating. And by having it online, we are creating a more accessible city. I think the second one is, funding. How can the city, which has got larger pockets than a lot of people in the city, how can they continue to partner with these local startups, with these local initiatives to show that, yeah, sure, you could, do tech anywhere. But if you come to Calgary, we've actually got a supportive council. We've got money to back you up. I got to experience this firsthand. I made an app for a school project for a city councilor. Then from there, we met more city councilors. Then we met police commissioners. Then we met police service members and then anti-racism members. And this was all because the council was able to actually reach out to us. They were involved. They wanted us to do well. And, these are things that, other councils just aren't doing. You send an email to someone saying, hey, I want to improve something you've spent the last 5 years working on. Sometimes people take that as an insult versus our council actually looks at that as, wow, this is great. How can we help you further that? So that is really great. And, when you add the backbone of, we've received funding from the city. The city's very excited about that. That is what's going to draw in a lot of talent. And then the last big important point I really want to make sure I hit, not just because I am the only, non-passing white in this call, but because it's just generally important for anyone in tech, is how do we diversify the sector? We've discussed, about, some of the disadvantages and advantages of, geography. We've talked a little bit about, credentials transferring over, but I think a really big exploration from council on how they can specifically use the assets they have in this city in a diverse and respectful way. I think those would all be awesome to hit.
Very well put. Greg?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't add much more to that. I think this notion of the supportive environment is the thing that we always need to be thinking about, and council always needs to be thinking about, because at Thin Air, we often talk about the fact that design is the conditions, is getting the conditions right for success. I mean, that's essentially all you're doing when you're designing something. It's like, here's something we want to have happen. What conditions need to be put in place so that thing happens? And If we're clear about what it is that we want to have happen here, then that can guide us, because we can ask the question, does this move us closer? If we take this step, does it move us closer? Does it create more of that environment that is going to be encouraging companies and people to locate themselves here and work together to create something, more than we already have? And I remember Mayor Nenshi saying years ago, like close to, I think around when he was first elected, that he was always fascinated by the fact that Calgary was a city on the verge of becoming, was the way that he used to describe that, right? Like that it's becoming something. And so if we're thinking about what is that, like what intention do we have for that? What is that going to look like? And I think a lot of things that we're talking about here as a more general piece of guidance, if we keep that in mind, then I think council can think about the things that it needs to do that moves us closer to that and not further away, and to unlearn some of the things that we've done in the past that are not going to do good work for us in the future. That's kind of how I think about it. How do we create the conditions?
I'm going to just vibe off of that statement because one of my favorite city builders, well known, of course, is Jane Jacobs. And what a lot of people don't know is that she was very interested in sort of the ecology of cities and their connection to economy and stuff. And if I could distill what she had to say, which marries with what you just said very well, is that her worldview is that there are no causes of poverty. There are only causes of prosperity. And setting that up is a really sort of critical opportunity. Alice, you want to take the last word?
No, I don't think I have anything to add to what Dennis and Greg just said. Fully agree. I think it's about, technology isn't a sector, it's across all sectors. And I think it's about not just focusing on building an innovation ecosystem or a technology ecosystem, it's about building one that's inclusive. And so that we can attract and retain and develop the right kind of talent, companies, and culture here in our city.
Something that I asked, another conversation I had, we were addressing Islamophobia and racism issues. And I guess I'll ask you guys, and are you hopeful for the city's prospects? And do you agree that we're at a really critical moment in our city's history where we could go in one direction or the other? How high are the stakes right now?
Nobody wants to be the first one to go on this question. All right, I'll go. I'll answer your last question first. The stakes are really high.
Yeah.
And I think that the window is probably not that large to make a move. And we have a lot of advantages, including quite a lot of wealth that's sitting in different places. It may not be in the bank account of the city of Calgary or the government, but there is a lot of wealth in this province, which should be something that should allow us to launch a really successful second curve, if you like, through this window of opportunity. So those are the things that make me really hopeful and optimistic that we will succeed in tackling this existential moment. So in that way, I see this huge opportunity for us to be to be exporting a completely different way of thinking about things from this place to the rest of the world. But the thing that I would tie to this as I think an important proviso, and it maybe ties to this question about what council should be doing, so much of it is about examples. Like, how many things can we put on the ground to actually show people so they can see?
Yes.
Yeah. Like that, PowerPoint presentations and hopeful conversations and all that kind of stuff do not translate to the momentum that we need. It needs to be like, for instance, we can't talk about diversity in tech if every class that we're pulling into Inception is just a bunch of white people who all fall into the same category, white males actually. It can't be like that. So we have to work hard to create examples that we put out there and not be afraid that some of them might not work, because even the example of doing things that might not work is a huge part of building the future that we can be optimistic about, because it's a mindset we must adopt. And so for me, it's existential. I'm very optimistic as long as we continue to show the courage to put examples on the ground and be willing to be wrong about some of these things, because that's not an existential move to be wrong. it's an existential bad move to not move and to not put examples there. So that's how I'd frame it.
I really appreciate that, Greg. I'm going to give it to Alice and Dennis. We've got under 5 minutes. So
I'm going to be quick. I agree with everything that Greg has said. And I think, you know, what's really, I'm incredibly bullish. You know, I'm born and raised here in Calgary. My kids are here. I participate in doing everything that I do so that we can create the city that my children will want to be here. My children will want to come back to, will, you know, have a family and babies, and, you know, we can continue to do that. So I think that's just incredibly important. And I think it's us also, you know, Greg talked about it as action oriented. You know, we have $100 million fund. We're just now investing in, you know, there's, you know, in incubators and accelerator programs. The province is behind that. The feds are behind that. We need to keep doing that. We absolutely cannot let the gas off of that. Yeah. And that means that, you know, our counselors of the future are going to have the courage to continue to put the gas, to continue to invest in that. And as Greg says, because, you know, it's not wrong to fail, but we have to, if we don't make those bold decisions and don't continue to invest, we will fail.
Last word goes to the young person and the person of color. Dennis.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about diversity, you know, Islamophobia and all of that, we can see that hate crimes are on the rise. You know, there's consistent white supremacy rallies that are happening right outside all the time. You know, people that look like me are being threatened and being attacked all the time. We're being blamed for viruses. We're being blamed for stealing jobs. We're being blamed for just about everything, and nothing is substantially getting better. Like, it's great that we're discussing things, but what good is that if someone that looks like me is going to get spit on their way into city council to talk about systemic racism? It's not working. And, you know, we even have a chief of police that says racism, systemic racism is real, yet continues to allow the gang suppression squad to chronically card colored folks. You know, I can tell you time after time, dehumanizing stories of being a colored person. Am I hopeful? Yes, because we really are backsliding. So, you know, how much more can we backslide before we move forward? How much of this is, you know, based on American politics, and how much of it is our own politicians? Those are great questions to have. You know, especially when you have someone like even our Minister of Justice, who himself is a Black man, but then goes against our own chief of police, saying he disagrees with systemic racism, and then tries to start a battle with the only Black law professor at the University of Alberta. You know, this talk about racism, and we're all being very great and inclusive, you know, most of it's a quack. You know, we're not really doing anything about it. We had a 3-day anti-racism hearing, and what are the results? Like, what binding actions has the anti-racism committee done that we can actually see a change in our community? Has policing gone down at all in the areas that we've highlighted? You know, if you're colored, you're 1.5 times more likely to be carded for no reason whatsoever. You know, specifically, Councillor Carra, I'm hopeful because there are people like you that are in council that are going to be trying to hold these people accountable. But as long as it's a bad swear word to call a white person racist when they're being racist, and, you know, we're too afraid to talk about the issues, the police are too afraid to charge someone, you know, with a hate crime, nothing's going to get solved. You know, until we see city councillors going outside and telling those white supremacists, enough is enough. Can you guys stop? Which, you know, personally, I've seen none of them do that once. Those are the kind of steps we need. And then when we're adding in the tech side, you know, how do we diversify tech so it's not just predominantly white males? How do we use tech as well to ensure diversity has improved? And as well, how do we use tech to report racism? That's what I have to say on that.
I think those are great marching orders from everyone. Thank you so much for a great conversation. And with like seconds to spare, thank you for your leadership in our community. Bye, everybody.
Good. Thanks,
Thank
GC.
you.
Thanks all.